that same shot there is this one here, and you see this waterway beginning to build up here. And that's what they call, at the test tank parlance, hydraulic jump. But that, when you start lifting the water, it weighs 64 pounds a cubic foot up to elevated heights like that, you know that you're lifting quite a bit of weight, and it is transformed into energy required, and that means that your driving force is reduced to some magnitude. Typically, the models are run at 3 degrees of heel, 10, 20, and 30 degrees, corresponding to the 7.5, 13, and 19.5 knots of true wind. We would set that off against the angles so we could angle heel, because those were realistic angles. You don't seldom want to be sailing for 30 degrees heel very often, and it gave us an ability to plot polar diagrams of performance and to recognize crucial levels of heel and or changes in the performance relative to the wind velocity. And for normal yachts, these wind velocities were picked out from a yacht called Gimcrack that were used to set up the force equations for getting together this whole science of test tank towing and performance prediction. This is 1964. Constellation came out, so this might have been 63 when these tests were done. And Roland Stevens yachts and Constellation became America's Cup Defender in later years, and or in 64. And we became aware of the need to modify the shape and form of the above water sections of the yachts to deal with the repeated and encountered seas. That is a very common study these days, and there's a great deal of science being imparted into those studies. Okay, this is 1963, and this was not this model, but it was a sister to it that was used at the Stevens Institute. There was a scientist there who was a staff scientist who looked over all the projects and programs going on and was available to confer with the clients of the laboratory. And I was talking to him at lunch one day, a little greasy spoon there at Woken when we were having lunch. And I said, boy, it's too bad we can't do a lot of this, all this preliminary stuff, and just get some gross ideas examined in a wind tunnel. He said, well, that'd be easy to do. We'd never get quantitative information. We could get a lot of qualitative. I said, let's do that. So we took this model, and back in the area where you see the tufts, that's where this waterway always seems to emanate from. We put manometer tubes into an array of manometers so we could read pressure, the changes in pressure all along that area, weather side and counter of the vessel. And lo and behold, there were a lot of indications of disturbed flow there. We also would slip into when we were running the model, we would slip a thermocouple or a thermistor, as they're called, or hot wire, and move it around in there so we could find the extent of the vortex that is unseen, but was bleeding off of the hull there when it was blown in the tunnel at a wind velocity corresponding to the general range of velocities that were expected during close-haul sailing. Incidentally, this model was later used for the EC-12 Radio Control Club. They just had their World Championships just before the end of the year, last year, in New Zealand. The Americans won. This boat was one of my very favorite yachts, whose underbody was very rapid. As you can see it here, that shape is unheard of. I mean, when I say it was unheard of, it was being addressed by many naval architects by that time, because this word got out of the tank test where we all talked about it, and I'm going to Stevens as an example, and I exchanged underwater photographs relating to 12-meter work. He was very helpful to me and very open to me. But that rear end there was, this boat was extremely fast, and that was the beginning of the so-called bustle that the IOR boats wound up having, and found their way into the later 12-meter models. Matter of fact, the underwater photos were already showing this, but it was after this stage. That was a 63 photo of the wind tunnel work. Anyhow, here's another boat, Morgan 45, which shows a much more controlled quarterway. She's got a little Bus Mosbacher steering that boat, and the wave is somewhat under control compared to what we had and could expect pressing the boat that hard in the open ocean. Okay, we're down to the point where we're going to start the construction of my entrant heritage in the America's Cup elimination trials. Heritage was built in St. Petersburg, Florida by our crew that normally would do the tooling and the prototypes of the models of yachts that we introduced. We chose,
Yeah.
you sure? Okay. We chose the construction method that had been evolved by the great builder, designer Bill Luters of Stamford, Connecticut, who had used a certain approach to construction for the American Eagle, which had sailed, I guess, in '64, and barely beaten by Constellation. I guess that's the time frame. Anyhow, we're starting to work on building the patterns and all for her construction. We used Western red cedar. We used aircraft grade Sitka spruce. And I have a funny story about that. When the word got out about her construction in the wood, I remember my assistant receiving a telephone call from someone that was irate that you yachtsmen kill a tree to build a Plato yacht, and oh my God, you know, we were in real trouble. Well, she came and told me the story, and I said, well, first place, this Sitka spruce was from the island of Kodiak off of Alaska, and the Western Redwood Association, I think that's the correct name for it, had the rights to salvage those timbers that had blown down and see if they got used in some way. And they also helped us acquire the select Western red cedar, which was very light, very strong, just a little less strength to weight ratio than the Sitka spruce, which was used for early aircraft. In any case, we made her planking full length by splicing the planks, and I want to go back one. I think here is another one. This lower shot is one of the laminated frames that Bill Luters had developed during World War II for making PT boats and minesweepers, and those were continuous laminations from shear to shear. We got rid of overlapping frames, floors, additional pieces, so you'll be able to see those in other shots. That was a significant weight saving, and now we're beginning to set up those in the shops. Here we go. There's a little close-up on it. And those are what we call the mold frames. Those are all laminated shear to shear, as was the forebright and the stem. All laminated with epoxy or resourceful glues. And they're setting those up. Now we can see they're set up, and you can see here the two bent frames. They are typically Lloyd's of London, who these boats were all had to be built under their survey. would examine all the wood and check it for the moisture density and so on. We kept that right at 12%, or the minimum I think was 12%, 12, 13% of moisture content to maintain the strength without additional weight. But we used American white ash in between. And those laminated frames were something like sided about 4 inches or 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches all in centimeters, millimeters. Anyhow, here's the prehistoric monster look. Here's how these frames went right straight across, all in one piece. And they were being set up. Here's the stern grite before you get to the horn timber, and that was vertically laminated in this part out of western red cedar. Forward of that, up in this region, you'll see a better shot later, was the keel where it was all changed over. The directional lamination went horizontal and was dense African mahogany. Now you can see these steel frames. Interesting thing here, these are steel frames. I had asked to let those frames be made of aluminum, and they would have been larger, much larger, and I wanted the so-called section modulus in order to make everything stiffer. So they wouldn't let me use aluminum, if I should use steel. So, well, may I use any kind of steel? Oh, yes. So I used 4130 aircraft chromoly steel. It was heat treatable, so they're much smaller and significantly stronger than they would have been had they not given me the gas about the aluminum. I could have an aluminum mass step right in there, but I couldn't have a steel frame. It's sort of interesting. Anyhow, here is the lead keel. At that time, that keel was the largest lead casting that had ever been made in the state of Florida, I was told. That keel was 54,000 pounds. I think we shaved off 1,000 pounds fairing it up, cleaning it up. We had over, at Gulf Coast lead in Tampa, over 100,000 pounds of lead molten. And that was near virgin lead. We bought new lead for that rather than the lead from the batteries. The difference in the density was about 686 or 8 pounds per cubic foot of old battery parts and so on. The lead weights off of tires. And the so-called virgin lead that we were able to get was a little over 700 pounds a cubic foot, but not absolutely the highest weight. So anyway, that's one view of it. That keel was wide as, almost as wide as my hand span across at the top. It was horizontal. And I want to tell you a little bit about the relationship on the yachts of this year sailing in 1958 in just a moment. There's another shape of that keel, picture of it. That was done in a concrete mold that was split down the center, had a thin layer of Bristol paper between the seams, and it was bolted together. And we dried it with butane blowtorch for 28 days to drive all the moisture out of it so it would not spoil when the hot lead was poured into it.